Hello and welcome. My name is Richard Hodges. I'm the regional sales manager for Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. Later, I'll be joined by my colleague Luc, who will be doing an interview with one of the breweries in Quebec, but more on that later. I'd like to start by saying thank you for taking your time. Today, we're going to talk about a rather interesting subject that I've spent a lot of time with in the last few years. Is interviewing brewers about it, dealing with customers as well who are making these particular beers. And then again, to be completely honest, consuming quite a few of them myself as well. I'm quite the fan of the non-alcoholic beers that are on the market. Being based here in Europe, we're seeing quite an influx of these onto the market. A little bit different situation maybe than in the North American market, but we might even be leading here a bit with the number on the market. But we're seeing huge growth in North America at the same time as well. A little bit about myself. I actually cut my teeth brewing in America at a small brewery in Lubbock, Texas, just at 20 years ago, before moving on to Germany to complete my brewmaster school here. Spent the last 10, 12 years brewing for some of the more well-known craft breweries in Germany and Italy as well. And before moving to Yakima Chiefs just about 2 years ago, it was a great transition, and I really enjoy working for a wonderful company. All right, so getting right to it here. Today we're going to discuss non-alcoholic beer, as well as on the kind of on to the side as well, a bit about some beverages that also contain hops as well that are non-beer related products such as kombucha. What we're seeing, especially, and I'll relate a lot of this to, especially to the European market, which seems to be growing quite quickly in the last few years here as well, is we've noticed a lot of innovation here, especially in the last 10 years. And it's kind of on two levels when you look at it, as we tend to do in the beer industry, as we talk about the macros and we talk about the micros side of things. Whereas with the macros, we tend to look at more of improved methods in innovation, more of a technical side of things. When we get to more of the craft range, we're going to talk about some a little bit more straightforward and easy ways to go about this process of making wonderful beers and high quality non-alcoholic beers that are also very, I'd say, competitive in their own right as well. We've seen a lot of growth in the last years with large breweries, and I think we've had a really nice selection of beers come out in the last few years, especially with some of the new techniques for the macros, including some of the larger brands from, for instance, Lef, which is a classic Belgian beer, super estery, fruity character, and you still retain a lot of that character. And yeast plays an important role on both ends of the spectrum, whether you're talking about micros or macros. And at the same time, with the micros, we're seeing just a really exciting rush right now, people putting out non-alcoholic beers from breweries that are 5, 10 hecto on up to 200 hecto breweries as well. So it's really interesting mixture of what we're seeing come to the market. What we are seeing time and time again, which is great news for us as well, is a lot of what's popular at the moment, especially when dealing with micros, tends to be hop forward beers. And I think going with this direction with hop forward beers gives you a little bit more room to expand on what we think traditionally as non-alcoholic beers in the market, which for the most part, most of us probably don't have a favorable of opinion of non-alcoholic beers. And there's probably good reason for that as well. But again, in the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen so many great gains in this area. It's definitely time to take another look at that. So I think first thing is to get to know your customer, of course, before you start looking at introducing maybe a new product as well, is maybe understanding who this product is going to be directed to from a marketing and sales standpoint. What we're finding out here, we're seeing it's really not about abstinence, where maybe traditionally think of someone who doesn't consume alcohol, maybe because of religious reasons or for health reasons or some other reasons they are no longer allowed to consume alcohol or do not want to consume alcohol for that matter. And we're seeing that less to be the case of the reason people are reaching for non-alcoholic beers. It's probably more about moderation is what we're seeing. It allows people in certain situations also to consume a beverage that maybe because of stricter alcohol laws that we're seeing also in the EU in the meantime as well, that it's just a safe alternative where you still get that flavor, you still get that enjoyment from it, but without the alcohol and the things that come along with alcohol at the same time, which in other situations might be wonderful, but maybe if it's an after work beer or something like that, or in the middle of the day at a presentation or whatnot, you can still have that sense of enjoyment with all the other things that might come along with it that aren't wanted at that time. The typical age range that we're seeing here is I think not surprisingly, but maybe surprisingly for some of you, is actually quite low. We talk about 25-year-olds, 45-year-olds. It's not also maybe stereotypically we think of it being something like a drink of maybe older people or something like that, and I don't think this is the case at any rate. So we're seeing it's interested from a large spectrum of people. And another aspect that we're seeing, I think this plays in a lot with also when we talked about the typical age range of starting around 25 years old, is this kind of more health conscious lifestyle as well, where we are talking about a product that is going to have reduced calories and in some cases very low calories, depending on how the non-alcoholic beer is going to be produced. It can also be isotonic, and I think this is an exciting and interesting thing that you see that you probably wouldn't typically link together is having brewery sponsor marathons, for example, is the classic one you see here in Europe, often with non-alcoholic beers, and they're actually handed this beer at the end of it because it is actually isotonic and replaces a lot of the vitamins and especially the minerals that have been lost during hard exertion, during exercising or whatnot. And they should taste good, and that's kind of the point too, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit about today. So. But I think this is what we're really looking about at the end of the day is potentially introducing a product that is only going to broaden the range. I don't think it's something that's going to replace, which is often a discussion that we have in breweries when we bring a new product onto the market, is are we going to cannibalize or end up hurting sales of a product that we have already in our portfolio on the market? And I don't think that's going to be the case here at all, because you're dealing with just a broader spectrum. You're going to pull in some of your regular customers, but you're also going to open up now your brand or your brewery to maybe customers who were not aware of you before. So it's a really interesting subject. This next slide, and I'm going to preface this by saying, please check with your local laws. I've grabbed this information from some very reliable sources, but having been a brewer myself in many different countries, as well as in the US, where it differs from federal law to state law, and down on to living in Texas, that we have dry counties and dry towns, at least when I was still living. I think most of that has hopefully gone away in the meantime. Check your local laws, but the thing I want to talk about here just briefly is the non-alcoholic beer and alcohol-free. From an industry standpoint, we use these when you go to events and you talk with other industry professionals. They almost get used interchangeably, as if there's no really meaning to the difference at all. And I think that's just kind of the way it's been accepted. Nevertheless, from a labeling law standpoint, and I'm sure most of you, especially if you're doing a packaged product and bringing that to market and have your beer in shelves, especially, that you're very familiar with educating and informing yourself concerning alcohol laws and labeling laws. And just some examples, looking at the UK, where they have 3 different ways of grading this, which is going to be low alcohol, non-alcoholic, and de-alkalized. Germany and Brazil. Brazil takes its lead often from Germany with some of its beer-based laws, even including some of those from the purity law, the Reinheitsgebot. Interesting enough, and they're using 0.5 ABV or less is just simply considered alcohol-free, but you could also call it non-alcoholic at the same time. And in the US, and this was the latest information I got, was 0.5 ABV is going to be considered non-alcoholic, and 0.0 can it then be referred to as alcohol-free. As I said, nonetheless, check with your local laws on this. One important point I do want to point out here is while we're using these interchangeably, I think it is very important that you're upfront with people about whether it is a 0.5 or a 0.0. Although we're talking 0.0 for the most part, we're dealing with macros where there's actually processes of removing alcohol down to 0.0%. Whereas with micros, especially what we're going to talk about today, you're probably more talking about that low alcohol 0.5 range. It does mean a difference for some people out there who want to consume zero alcohol versus people who are just looking for a non-alcoholic beverage at 0.5. So I think it is important to be clear with those people who, for religious reasons or health reasons, whatever reason, cannot consume any alcohol at all. So just to be aware of that as well, I think is an important point to make. Production challenges of non-alcoholic beers. So as just a general umbrella to look at this, there's basically two ways that we're going to talk about here briefly. And again, I want to give you guys a general overview of what we're talking about with non-alcoholic beers. I think the important thing here is if you're not familiar with this or you're interested in it, is to kind of get the palate wet, kind of an appetizer for what you're getting into with doing this. I think it's a very exciting field, of course. And at the same time, I think there's a lot of possibility to be creative there, which is kind of what we talk about with craft beer. The whole premise behind it was to be creative, to be different. And there's so much room to experiment there. And I think that's what this makes us also really exciting. And I think we're really just on the beginning phases of micros and craft brewers getting into this. And I think that's really what's going to drive the change for this, of how it's seen from not only from a brewer standpoint, but also from a consumer standpoint. So we're talking about two different ways, basically, and that's one is going to be removal of alcohol, which is going to be the typical process, especially when we talk about the traditional beers on the market that I came up with also that were on the market, which were from the larger breweries. The macros had processes, and there's several different methods of doing this. And we're not going to go, like I said, in depth in that, but we'll kind of do a general overview of that today. And then the other process, which was maybe, especially what I saw a lot in Germany, and it's still being used today, is actually just stop it from being produced. And there's a couple different ways to go about that as well. There's traditional method, and then there's the new kind of version of that, which we'll get into a little bit today as well. But more importantly, we'll have a brewer at the end of this. We're going to have an interview with my colleague Luc, and one of his customers from a brewery in Quebec who's making a really nice non-alcoholic NIPA. And they'll talk a little bit about that process as well with the yeast. So with arrested fermentation or even thermal removal of alcohol, which was kind of the two traditional methods, there's a lot of drawbacks to these methods. And if you've tasted non-alcoholic beers in the last 10 years, 15, 20 years or so, you were probably, painfully aware that there were some shortcomings in these beers. And a lot of this has to do for various reasons. But for instance, when you have something like a process where it actually stops fermentation from being produced, you're kind of shortchanging the fermentation cycle from completing. And what you're going to end up having is a lack of important, especially this ester profile that's going to be produced, and as well as a variety of other aromas during the fermentation process, or even driven off to an extent during the fermentation process as well, to give us that typical beer character, without even getting into hops or whatnot at this point. Also, with this kind of arrested fermentation method, they typically tend to be overly sweet, because we're leaving quite a bit of sugar in there that's unfermented. And probably the biggest kicker, especially for us as brewers, where when we're brewing beer, we all like to take the first runnings, or I think most of us like to take the first runnings and get a good sip of it and got a good kind of impression of the malt character and how the beer is going to be. What I don't want in my finished beer is any quality of wort, that kind of unfinished or early fermentation stages that you still have in the beer, in the very young beer that you can find. And that's typically what is very characteristic of these non-alcoholic beers that have been that they have used a arrested fermentation process. And that's probably one of the biggest kickers for all of us. And there are some maybe new modern ways to get around that as well. When talking about thermal removal, some of the biggest problems has been that, again, these esters and this fermentation, these products that are produced in fermentation play such a deciding role between what tastes like beer, as we think of beer, and some product that has a kind of similarity to beer, but not really. And that's what we end up doing, is when we're thermally removing alcohol, we're taking a lot of things that are important, acetate groups, is being removed along with the alcohol at the same time. And some of the other processes that we're going to talk about here, while some non-alcoholic beers are going to end up a little bit full-bodied or sweet, there's other processes that might leave it actually a little bit empty, not enough body. Alcohol does play a important role actually in the body of beer itself, beyond the non-fermentable sugars as well, that obviously play an important role as well. So again, a brief overview here. With arrested fermentation, the interesting thing about this, and like I said, this is a process that I actually first became familiar with in my time brewing in Germany, and it's still quite common there. It is, of course, you can use existing equipment already found in the brewery, so the investment costs from your standpoint are not very high. The wort is not completely fermented out, hence not having the high levels of alcohol. You would also probably typically start with a little bit lower gravity as well, so you're not just overly cloyingly sweet. Nevertheless, it's still going to be, you're going to have this low ester production, which means it's going to have a little bit of that character of beer. But what you're also going to get, unfortunately, the drawback to most of these beers that we see is going to have this increased or sustained wort character. Very similar to if you're brewing often enough in there checking your beers on a daily basis after pitching the yeast, it's kind of that quality of about the second day into fermentation, maybe the first day in, where it's young beer, there's fermentation going on, but you still have an overwhelmingly wort character, still kind of that hop tea wort character that's going on there, and that's what a lot of these beers display. And again, since they're not completely fermented out, you're not going to have the esters to kind of have that full complete character. Wort flavor, and typically tend to be sweet and malty. And at the same time, depending on the starting gravity, also tend to have a little bit of a very coating full bodiness to the beers as well. So, and then what I'm going to refer to here is non-alcoholic yeast. There are some bacteria as well, and there's a palette out there, and I think we could do a webinar just about those at some point. But the point of today is kind of give just a general overview of everything. And there's a lot of yeast banks out there as well that are specializing in this, and definitely reach out to your favorite yeast bank wherever you're procuring your yeast from at the moment, and I'm sure they will have a plethora of information about this and should be offering products as well. I'm just going to generically call them non-alcoholic yeast. And the interesting thing about this, and this is kind of the new wave where things get exciting, which although this existed for some time, that it's being implemented now on a smaller scale. Referring to craft breweries, we have 10 hecto and 20 hecto brew houses now, only putting out 800 hecto a year, and they're producing non-alcoholic beers now. It's quite amazing, and a lot of this has to do with, again, you can use existing equipment already found in the brewery, which is already the first step into the door. There's not a lot of changes, not a lot of equipment you have to invest in, and space that you have to find in the brewery, which is always a problem as well. So the ones that I'm going to talk about today, briefly, is the Saccharomyces strains that basically, for the most part, we're dealing with yeast strains that cannot ferment maltose, which is two glucose molecules, or if you have three, maltose, and they just can't ferment them effectively. So kind of start thinking about what that means when we talk about wort. Typically, the composition of wort is hence a maltose and malt, those two being connected. Talking about just from the background is that overwhelmingly we're dealing with maltose sugar that's going to be consumed by the yeast during fermentation. So if they can't use this during fermentation, then it's a different way of thinking about how you're going to produce your wort and what should be the makeup of your wort as far as simple sugars versus complex or non-fermentable sugars as well. So to get you kind of thinking there as well about how you want to do that. There's at least three things that I'll throw out there right away that you can probably spend some time doing some research and thinking about how you would attack this situation as well. And that's, of course, the use of specialty malts to boost flavor in a beer, where you're and maybe even give the beer a little bit more body as well. At the same time, not provide as many fermentable sugars. Mashing program. Mashing program is where you're going to lay down the composition or the layout of which sugars or how much of the sugars are going to be found in your wort before fermenting. And so you can, it's going to be a play between the specialty malts you're choosing, which I've seen recipes that kind of defy what I would consider a normal recipe guideline for brewing a typical beer, because you're playing by different rules here. So if you're thinking that maybe the max would be 15, 20, 30% crystal malt, something like that, you have to maybe rethink these notions of how you're using crystal malts and what percentages you can use in it, and really kind of back away from what you've known to be typical for a beer recipe and approach it from a new angle. And that's what I'm talking about here with specialty malts as well. And as well with the mashing program. What are you trying to get out of there, and what enzyme should you be activating, and which one should you maybe be avoiding completely during the programs of your mashing program as well? I guess starting gravity. If you're using, for example, in this case, a strain of yeast that's not going to ferment maltose, then I don't want to have a lot of maltose left over in the beer. I'm going to end up with a very sweet beer, a sticky beer at the same time. And that's not what we're really looking for at the end of the day either, unless we're brewing a non-alcoholic barley wine, which maybe that's the next thing. I don't know, but probably not what you're looking to do. So probably adjusting your starting gravity as well so that you end up with less of these sugars would be a very important thought as well in the planning process of this. So going back now to I see the more traditional style, and these are the beers that you've probably grown up with or have had from time to time, or maybe even I say, we make fun of this often that you've suffered through as a non-alcoholic beverage in a certain situation. And these are just a brief overview. There are quite a few methods, other methods as well. And I will say an important note here before I go into this as well, dealing with macros, is macros have found in the last 10 to 15 years, there are some new methods that are being implemented. And of course, they're always improving. You know, we're talking about breweries that have this possibility to invest in research on a large scale to improve methods that they're doing here, which is a very different situation than most craft brewers that we're talking about. And they have done this, and they've gotten very, very good at what they do with removing alcohol. Maybe even too good that they were removing too much of the beer original character, and that's what they're trying to prove on, of course. So the important point here that I want to point out is that where most success has been seen here is, of course, alluding to what I just mentioned, is that they've just made incredible leaps and gains in the technology here. Most of the best quality beers that are being produced on a non-alcohol level from the macros that I've seen, and this also goes for craft as well, is a combination of more than one process. So I want to just put it out there too, that to remember, it's not about finding a process to make a non-alcoholic beer and making that beer. It's about being able to look at all the different processes that are available to you and finding the right combination. So I just mentioned on the last slide that we talked about specialty malts, maybe in proportions that wouldn't be typical for you. Looking at your mashing program, and maybe even in a mashing program that you would never have used those enzymes in that combination, but for this beer it makes more sense, as well as the starting gravity as well, adjusting that. And I think that's what you have to look here, is kind of look at everything new, and kind of you're looking at building a new monster. I think maybe the worst thing that could happen here, or maybe the mistake before you get down the wrong path here, is to try to take an existing beer recipe that you have and say, we're going to make the non-alcoholic version of that. And I think that's where time and time again, where we see people running into trouble. I almost feel at this point, if you're going to do that, then you're probably better off trying to build that recipe new again, just for the non-alcoholic version. Try to get as close to it as you can, but the method in getting there is not going to be, here's the beer, take out the alcohol, and now we have the non-alcoholic version. And that's what's, I will say, probably failed time and time again in the last 10 or 15 years, in which why people haven't enjoyed those beers. I think the new way of thinking is to approach that non-alcoholic version of that beer, but in a different mindset and trying to combine methods as well. So when you look at these methods here, long story short, a lot of the larger breweries are combining methods in the meantime to get wonderful results. Get a lot more dynamic, a lot more dynamics, a lot more kind of knobs that you can turn on to adjust things and kind of fine tune things. And that's where we're seeing a lot of success in the last 5 or 10 years with non-alcoholic beers. So typical one, we're seeing as a membrane separation, or even dialysis, which falls in the STEM category as well. So you don't have this traditional, we talked about earlier, thermal removal of alcohols. You don't have these disadvantages for flavor and aroma, which was an amazing step forward as well. At the same time, it is a very high cost for equipment. This is not something you're going to find in of course, not every brewery, but not many breweries at the same time. What we see also in typical for Europe, that we'll see there might be a regional brewery that has invested one of these technologies here, or maybe two of them if they're doing a combined process, maybe even. And what they end up doing is they'll do the non-alcoholic beers for other breweries. So the beers are actually put into trucks and tanks and sent there, and they can actually do this process, or just simply brew it at the brewery if they have capacity for it. So this is not something that just every brewery is picking up at the same time, which is why we're again dealing with probably on a macro level, and even there, it's not necessarily every brewery has it. So high cost for equipment on this one. This is going to be a kind of reoccurring theme when dealing with these methods here, and of course the additional space that's required in the brewery. Especially when we're dealing with smaller breweries, it's probably already pretty tight. And I'd much rather put in a few fermenters probably before putting in some kind of a device like this. as well. And the fermenters are probably a lot cheaper anyway. So vacuum evaporation or vacuum distillation or even centrifuging is also something that we're seeing. And again, this is a method that we're seeing also maybe combined with other methods as well. A loss of aroma is more typical of this. Unfortunately, it's a bit hard to avoid. At the same time, body. When removing alcohol, you have to remember also that alcohol does play an important role in the body of beer. It's not something we talk about often, but it is very important and vital. And we'll come to it a little bit later. But alcohol plays an important role in beer. There's no way around it. So when you don't have it in there in the amounts you're used to, that's why I talk about re-engineering or re-tinkering and thinking about how you're going to build that beer. Also, loss of carbonation as well here, which can be added back, but then you have additional costs as well. And then it can also enhance kind of nuanced, unwanted flavors in beer as well, which is a problem, of course. What's interesting about this is reduced alcohol and calorie versions of an existing beer. I mentioned an example earlier here in Belgium. We're seeing from some of the larger breweries as well. Really well-made beers, non-alcoholic beers that you're using these processes here in extremely low calories. And that's very, I think, you have a lot of flavor and low alcohol and low calorie. I think that speaks to a lot of people, especially depending on the weather or the current situation, whatever else. There's definitely a market for it, and we're seeing that with the growth in the numbers here for sure. So I spoke on this just a moment ago about alcohol's role in beer. And again, I'm keeping this very low tech today. I just want to, my goal is I want to pique your interest and maybe inspire you to go down this road and look a little bit more into these beers, because the market's there and it's for the taking. I'll give you an example of Van der Streek, which is a brewery in the Netherlands. It's from Nicholas Sonnen is a colleague from mine. It's one of his customers there, and then we got to visit with him a bit and talk about their beers. And they introduced, I want to say it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago. This is a same kind of a classic craft brewery brewing. We have some stouts, IPAs, a nice, a nice portfolio of different beer styles. Had the idea that they wanted to introduce a non-alcoholic beer about, like I said, about 3 or 4 years ago. And in the meantime, I think they have another one they've also introduced, but that original beer they introduced, which is now award-winning non-alcoholic beer, I believe it's called Playground from Van der Streek. That's the #1 selling beer. So in a very short time frame, they went from a successful craft beer brewery who was doing fine, had this interesting idea to introduce a hoppy version of a non-alcoholic beer, and suddenly it's their #1 selling beer. And I'm not in the Netherlands, I'm in Belgium, and I can find it at my grocery store. It's doing extremely well. So I think, again, from top to bottom, you have to think out of the box and kind of forget about what you knew about non-alcoholic beers or what you think about them. And I think we need some of those creative minds out there to look at this new and grab the subject and run with it. There's a lot that can be done with this there. So again, not getting technical, I'm looking here to inspire you a bit. So even dealing with alcohol here, it's important to note that alcohol is such a key factor in beer. It just from top to bottom, it affects so many things in the beer that when you remove it, it's almost like you had a house built of cards. Taking out the alcohol, everything just kind of falls together. And what we're talking about here with mashing different yeast strains, different gravity as well, especially malts, is putting that glue in place. So when the alcohol is not going to be there anymore, that you still have a solid foundation for a solid beer, and not some kind of beer substitute tasting liquid, which is often the case. And it's possible, it's out there. It's really exciting what's going on these days. So, alcohol works as a flavor enhancer. Even, think about cooks in the kitchen who are adding, whether it's a splash of white wine or red wine or sherry to a particular dish or whatever. Those things add flavor to it, of course. But the alcohol also plays a key role in the perception of flavors on the tongue itself. So when we remove that alcohol, we're obviously going to simply from the beginning taste things differently than had the alcohol been there, as we're used to having it there. So it is a flavor enhancer, and removing a flavor enhancer, if you take the salt out of food, and I'm not comparing alcohol to salt, although maybe both of them in high amounts aren't good for you, it does play a strong role in the perception of flavor. Perceived bitterness, therefore, is going to be affected at the same time. So bitterness levels, again, this is not taking a beer you have and then making a non-alcoholic version. This is about re-engineering, reworking it, So this is something that will also have to be dealt with. And if you're doing a stop fermentation, you're going to have probably a lot of sweetness to deal with anyways. And even if you're using a special yeast strain, you'll probably have slightly more sweetness than you are accustomed to, especially if you're using a little bit more crystal malt. You're going to have that kind of enhanced kind of sweet caramel flavors as well. So like I said, there's a lot of thinking that goes into this, but that's all kind of cool, fun stuff, I think. As well as perceived body. Not something we talk about a lot, but alcohol does play a role in the perceived body of a beer as well. It gives a certain amount of body to a beer. You can have a very highly attenuated beer, very highly attenuated, yet still have a certain amount of perceived body in it, simply because of the higher alcohol levels. And we see that actually quite a bit here in Belgium, where you have a very strong beer, a lot of alcohol, not a lot of body in it. Not a lot of residual sugar in it. At the same time, it still has a nice body to it, and that's these games that you can play with using like candy sugar or whatever it might be, and that's interesting, and that's balance, and that's a lot of technique and experience going on there. And then again, perceived sweetness, just like with bitterness, perceived sweetness, how you pick up the sweetness, also the flavors and the sweetness that you're picking up from the beer itself plays a vital role, and there's no way around it. So you can't avoid it. So what you have to do is kind of learn to work with it. So in alcohol itself, of course, if you've had enough nice beers, especially some stronger beers, one of the things we look at and judge is it smell alcoholic? Should it smell alcoholic at the same time? Maybe there's beer styles where that's allowed and other ones that shouldn't be, although you do find it in the beer. So alcohol is going to play an important role in the aroma itself, or the flavor profile of a beer style itself. So I hope you got it at this point, alcohol plays a vital role. So not having it there is going to be some work for us to get around. So now we get to I think some of the fun stuff here is brewing non-alcoholic beer. And I think hops and malts, and I'm going to use this, I like to say they play an essential role for making up. I don't like the term mask. If you're trying to mask something, I have the impression in dealing with beer that you're trying to hide something. And that's not the case here. We're not trying to hide something. I think we understand, especially from what I talked about earlier, is we're not going to have the complexity from the fermentation that we would have had with a typical beer. And at the same time, we're also not going to have the amounts of alcohol in a beer that we typically would have. Therefore, we're not going to have that enhancement or that altered kind of perceived flavor of bitterness, sweetness, as well as body from the beer. So we're going to have to make up for those things. I'm not trying to mask any of that. I don't want to hide it. I just want to be able to kind of build my house back with a solid foundation. And that's what I'm looking at doing here. So let's make up for any loss in character in the beer styles that have, I see typical amounts of beer. Obviously, if you're going from a 2.5% beer to a 0.5% beer, probably pretty close enough to one another, you're going to be fine. But I'm talking more of the 5s and the 6, especially when you get in the 7 range with IPAs and things like that, where you're used to a certain amount of body and flavor and whatnot from that alcohol as well. That's where things get a little bit more tricky, and they're going to require a little bit more creativeness. So use of specialty malts, as I spoke about earlier, you can counteract a lot of mouthfeel and body losses and aroma at the same time due to lack of alcohol. Again, some people talk about non-alcoholic beers as being too thin. Some talk about them being too full. And that's, again, let's look at your mashing program. Let's look at your starting gravity, and let's look at your use of specialty malts, because just those 3 things alone can heavily influence what kind of body you're going to have left over at the end of the beer. Is it going to be a little bit more body in the beer, or is it going to be a very thin beer? I'm going to need some making up. So the whole time you're kind of conceptualizing this idea for what kind of beer you want to brew and how you're going to go about brewing it, you have to keep all these things in mind. It's a lot of moving pieces, but when you get them lined up right, boy, it makes for an amazing product at the same time. And we've had quite a few people that have gotten it right here as of late. And the numbers are growing. It is quite impressive at this time. So a careful hand should be used when using specialty malts, as we all know, because as I said, what I'm seeing is, especially with specialty malts, is a lot of this new way of thinking is specialty malts in extreme high concentrations, or even specialty malts that maybe weren't typical for that style. And I think that is wonderful. And that's the creativity that we're seeing going on here. At the same time, I think it's important to remember, if you're trying to re-engineer or rebrew a product that's existing here, you can get out of style very quickly. Whether it's going to be malty, caramel, or toasty flavors that are coming from this specialty malt or the crystal caramel malt that you're using. And that's something to keep in mind again, which is why, again, my belief is which is often stronger than fact. But my personal belief is that I think it's about rebuilding a beer as opposed to simply just taking this, subtract one, and now we have this. I think that's probably the wrong route to go from my experience and what I've seen, and also talking to brewers. It's really about re-engineering it, putting a lot of thought into it, and the pieces are there. Just have to get them in the right place. And that's the craft part of it right there. Residual sweetness found in beer, which again, depending on your starting gravity, if you're going with the yeast strain variation here, which is what I'm kind of talking to today, more focused on, especially with our interview that's going to be following this, is you're probably going to be talking about a certain amount of residual sweetness left in the beer. And of course, straightforward way of going about this is, of course, is you're going to need a solid bitterness. Bitterness is not bitterness. Bitterness has levels of strength from a standpoint of perception. And another way of putting that, which I prefer to talk about bitterness, is simply quality of bitterness. 20 IBUs measured in the laboratory, which is probably where IBU should stay. 20 IBUs measured in the laboratory is not 20 IBUs from another beer. You could two different beers, both measure 20 IBUs, but the perceived bitterness from those can be very, very different. And of course, one might be okay. One has more residual sugar, the other doesn't, so therefore it's going to. But let's take two equal beers, and I switch out the bittering hop for a rather strong alpha version versus a hop that has a very low alpha. But they're both measured 20. I'm still going to have a quality of bitterness there. And now, which one you prefer, that's a matter of taste. That's philosophy at the end of the day. One is not better than the other. It's a quality in the sense of which one you're looking for. And what I definitely think is the help that you're looking for with this particular situation is a rather strong, solid bitterness. It's a high quality, it's a smooth bitterness that you're probably looking for to balance this out. But you definitely want a high quality bitterness. And again, that's a philosophy, something that you're looking for here. If you've got a favorite hop that you're using for those big, strong beers, this is the one that I would probably go toward. But again, that's philosophy. That's where I would probably go for a starting stone, is going with that. And I'm not saying to up your IBUs, but I'm saying make sure that you know that bittering hop you're using is going to deliver a solid bitterness. Good. So what I actually like to use, or what I recommend quite a bit, is OL is Warrior. It's a great bittering hop. I think it's a very diverse. It is that solid punch bitterness. And I think once you're used to using that, I think it can deliver that nice bitterness for a variety of styles. Kind of a throwback where I kind of cut my teeth here 20-something years ago. Pre-dry hopping with Columbus and Chinook. We actually, these at one time for us were overwhelmingly just bittering hops, and I think they still do a wonderful job of that, as well as dry hopping. Probably my two favorite hops to dry hop are right there, Columbus and Chinook still. And I think bittering with those also provides a nice solid bitterness, and then you kind of get into those flavor profiles too. And if you want to go back and say you're doing like some first wort hopping and some interesting things, where you're getting those oxidative components in there right from the beginning. And you're talking about maybe delivering some of those even flavors, those piney kind of grapefruit flavors, as a base flavor in the beer, even prior to getting to cooking. And like I said, there's a lot of things that can be played with here to deliver that flavor and bitterness in beer. Only dealing with the first additions here in the beer before you even get into dry hopping and whatnot. So definitely worth doing some thinking here and some considering, because bitterness is not bitterness. There's different qualities of bitterness. And which one's the right one for you? Talk to your local regional sales manager. If you're in my area, talk to me, and we can talk about that and get you the right thing. So now getting toward the back end of beer, or the finishing side of beer. Like I said, probably the biggest problem from my standpoint, or the biggest challenge, let's call it, that needed to be overcome with non-alcoholic beers in the last years, and still to this day, probably is just a lack of complexity. It's such a complex aroma profile in beer prior to adding hops. There's such a complex profile there in the base aroma that is just simply lacking in non-alcoholic beers, that therefore they're not bad beverages, they're just not beer. And we've all kind of had that feeling sitting there drinking it going, this is not bad, but it's not beer. And kind of getting around that is difficult. But I think armed with looking at proper yeast strains or methods, even if you have the option of combining two different methods, it would be the ideal thing. Looking at your mashing protocol, your specialty malts, and of course your starting gravity. And then we've got you up to now adding your bittering, your base bittering, maybe even some flavoring there as well with your base bittering in the beer. You're getting there. You're getting to where you're trying to make up for some of that lack of complexity from the fermentation. But here's where we can really make things interesting, especially dealing with the craft market where we have, and thankfully so, because I love these beers very much. Big stout drinker and whatnot. But I came up with American Brown and Pale Ale and IPAs and double IPAs, and so I really like hoppy beers. And I love the fact that we're seeing these come out. So now it gets more interesting because we've built a beer that's meant to kind of make up for those lacking fermentation quality and profiles. And now we can get really creative because now we can start adding some flavors in and some aromas in there that are going to take maybe a pretty straightforward non-alcoholic beer and make it very complex and interesting to the nose and to the mouth as well, to the tongue. So, and I want to start here with a bit of, theoretical way of looking at this. We know in the meantime that flavors, especially aromas, are linked to our memories in our mind. So when you smell or taste something and you know it, then you say, okay, that's rosemary, or that's green apple, or that's the dreaded diacetyl. You know those, and hopefully you don't get the diacetyl too much. But when you smell those, you know those because you're confronted with them from time to time, or you've trained yourself to recognize those. But there are other aromas that are out there that maybe you're like, oh, what is that? I know that. And what you're trying to do at that point, and what your mind's trying to do, is trying to connect it to a memory. And it might be a location. It doesn't even have to be a particular food or whatever. It might just be a location. Oh, I was here. I remember that. And so the interesting thing about that is we often link flavors and aromas with experiences, long story short. And some of these interesting flavors and really amazing what's going on with, especially talking like Sabro and Talus and these new hops that are coming out here, is they're presenting us with some aromas that were maybe not typically associated with hops, at least in recent times anyways. And some of those I've listed here, like cream, vanilla, and coconut, which is a wonderfully interesting topic because when we think about vanilla, vanilla in itself doesn't have a lot of body to it. It doesn't have a lot of mouthfeel. But almost all of us, when we think of vanilla, probably think of something that has to do with a dairy product and something automatically also with something that is cream. A cream, whether it be some kind of tropical drink or even a yogurt or whatnot, or ice cream, for example, which shouldn't be so vanilla. Vanilla shouldn't be a generic thing. It's actually quite a wonderful thing. So if we can present cream, vanilla, and coconut flavors, which all those typically tend to be associated with something very common, a common thread there, is already a perceived perception of not only positive thoughts, of course, which are always good, but you have kind of this association with things that are maybe full-bodied, obviously tropical, we think right away, but also there's a complexity between those things as they're combined there, which again, body, very important. We think of a perceived, especially in the flavor, say, oh, this is kind of a cream vanilla flavor to it. I'm already thinking cream vanilla mouthfeel, although it may not necessarily be the case. And that's kind of the game that we're playing here with these flavors and aromas as well. And that's an important aspect that can be, there's a lot to do there and a lot of important things. But I want to put up Sabro here, which is one of the, just such a, once you get above that 20-30% threshold of Sabro, and especially dry hopping in the beer, it just really brings out these coconut flavors. And I think there's so much to be done there and added characteristics to beer. I think these new varieties that are coming out with the HBCs and Talus now on the market with this kind of wonderful, very, very distinct yet soft kind of, I guess they're describing it as like a pink grapefruit, but it's just kind of a different grapefruit than how we've known in the past with hops. Also wonderful quality as well. So I think this is an interesting topic that should be explored and needs exploring, and I would like to see you guys doing that as well. I think now when we get down to adding aroma and complexity to the beer as well, I think we talk about more about what's going on now, especially with the IPAs. And you can't get around something like a Simcoe, which is kind of an all-purpose single hop, blends well with, I just can't think of many combinations Simcoe doesn't work well as. All by itself or in small percentages, it's just always going to do its thing there, which is, high linalool contents, especially with, just like classic, I think of like Fruity Pebbles cereal, just wonderful. Sometimes you're going to get a little You're going to get a little of the pine in there as well, which is nice. And this is just something that's going to give you such a wide spectrum in a non-alcoholic beer, even in small amounts. So we're not talking about, I mentioned IPAs, but I think it's important at the same time to mention it doesn't have to be an IPA. Let it be a lighter golden ale or a lightly hopped pale ale. You can bring so much flavor and nuance with small additions of hops as well. It's important to remember that we don't have to hammer these beers with hops as well. I like them that way, but we don't have to hammer them to make them too complex and to kind of make up for that lack of character. There's a few different routes that can be going here with non-alcoholic beers going forward as well. I put up the diagram here, Idaho 7, which is for me, it's like the second coming of a Simcoe. I remember when Simcoe came out, and this Idaho 7 is just, I got to brew with it about a month or two ago, and it just really, in the cryo form, in fact, just kind of blew me away. It was really dank up front, and it was kind of like a mixture of pineapple in a bag of weed, if I may say that. But during fermentation, quite a bit changed, and it definitely just went onto this super sweet fruit, tropical, aromatic. A lot of the dankiness kind of dropped off into the background. Definitely blew off in the during the fermentation, because you got it every time you walked in the brewery. A lot of that just dankiness was gone by the end of fermentation, but just a wonderful hop. And I put this up here because we're going to come back to this diagram actually a second ago, because again, getting back to complexity in all seriousness here, this is a way of adding that complexity to beer, which is definitely needed in non-alcoholic beers. Again, small amounts can go a long way. You can be judicious with this. At the same time, it just makes a wonderful way of adding these tropical and equinaut with this, especially this last year's crop with huge red berries, just beautiful hop. So the last slide that I want to present here before we move on to my colleague with his interview is the nuances again. And I think it's important. I put crystal up here, and we'll come back to that in just a second. There's a lot of aromas out there that can be added to beer beyond just the spectrum of tropical and fruity. And I just think it's important to keep those things in mind as well, because while we can build on building blocks of tropical and fruity and keep building it up and everything, I think with non-alcoholic beers, my opinion, it's going to be essential that we don't build up with a particular flavor, fruity, tropical. We have that, we can do that. But I think it's important to keep in mind it's also about spectrum, especially when dealing with maybe the more fine, nuanced versions of non-alcoholic beers that I hope to see in the market very soon. I would love to see the umbrella expand beyond, but I love the start we're getting right now at the same time. And we talk about like the crystal, which wonderful whirlpool hop, by the way, too, if you're talking about survivables. Columbus and Nugget. And I'm talking about using these hops on the finishing side of things. If we take crystal, for example, here, and you see it's got this kind of wood, citrus character, a little bit of stone fruit. And I want you to think, if you look at this map here for a second, you see berry at the top, stone fruit, melon, and herbal and grassy and all that. And in my idea, what I would be looking at for these beers, because we're talking about making up for a lack of complexity here, is not to continue with one, we're going to add one aroma spectrum and stay there, but rather let's add a complete spectrum on that beer. Kind of if you picture that as the top of your pint glass, you're looking inside of your pint glass, and I see, oh, this has got woody and citrus. But if I go back now for just 1 second to the last hop and look at Idaho 7, I'm adding a whole nother spectrum. So if I can combine an Idaho 7 and a crystal, then I'm looking at, this is taking care of that whole fruit tropical section, and then add some crystal on top of it. Now I've got citrus, I've got some nice wood, a little bit of the vegetable character, especially with Nugget, just really nice character in there where you get this kind of pungent aromas as well that just fill it out. And kind of think about looking down your pint glass, like you look at this diagram here. And I think that one of the key things that we can do, especially with non-alcoholic beers, is give yourself a spectrum of flavors. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. You're already going to start with your mashing program, with your specialty malts, and you're really just going to get it done. And at the end of the day, I think you're going to be really happy if you play a little bit outside of those boxes, those rules, and kind of look at that beer differently, top to bottom, and give it as much character as possible. Nuanced character is wonderful here because remember, you're replacing nuances, which doesn't mean we need to put the hammer down on it. We just need to make sure that there's characteristics in there to keep the beer interesting and give it this beer-like quality. So with that said, I would like to thank you guys for taking the time, joining me today. And I appreciate it very much. And we'll now continue with my colleague, Luc, who is actually responsible. He's Director of Sales Canada. And I'm going to pronounce this wrong because I speak German, but no French. He's speaking with his buddy from Quebec Brewery, Cibois. Maybe that's actually halfway correct, who's producing a couple of different beers now, non-alcoholic beverages as well. And they're actually producing one with cryopop, which is in itself an exciting using blends of hops to get these incredible survival amounts. That Spencer's done an incredible job on developing that as well. And yeah, I'm going to let him take it away. I appreciate you guys for taking the time, and hope to see you guys all soon. And I hope, at the very least, it was interesting, and at the very best, I've inspired you to dig into the books and contact your local yeast bank and your local RSM from Yakovic. Get the hops ordered, get the yeast ordered, start working on the mash program, and mash it in as soon as possible. Hope to see you guys soon. Thanks.
So hi everyone, welcome. I'm Luc Beaulieu. I'm the Director of Sales Canada for Yakima Chief, and I'm now with Jonathan Godreau from Ciboire Microbrewery in Sherbrooke, Quebec. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, Luc.
The funny thing, it's we're two guys from a small region in northern Quebec, so our main language is French, and we're now talking in English or speaking in English to lots of brewers around the world. So we'll try to do our best. But thanks for being here with us. Ciboire Microbrewery, can you talk to me about a bit more about the brewery and what you guys do usually as beers and everything?
Yeah, so hi everyone. Ciboire, I'm the brewmaster of Ciboire since 2007. We have 3 brew pubs, 2 in Sherbrooke and 1 in Montreal. So we are kind of small brewery with three places. And in the last maybe 4 years, we brew a lot of New England IPA, but we still brew a lot of fruit beer, a lot of Pilsner. So we have different kind of beer in our portfolio. And that's it. I know Luc since his beginning with Yakima, so I'm very glad to be here with you today.
Thank you. But we're here especially to talk about non-alcoholic beer. The fun thing, you're brewing non-alcoholic beer for, I think, 1 year. There's your flagship non-alcoholic called Discipline. That's an amazing beer. And we also did a collab together called Pop Cycle with Cryopop not too long ago. And it's not to brag, but I think it's one of the best New England IPAs or NAB or IPAs that I never had in my life. So can you tell us why you decided to do non-alcoholic beer and especially an IPA like this?
Yeah, so we have been looking for non-alcoholic beer since maybe 4 or 5 years, and since it's getting more and more popular, I had an eyes on this. But honestly, the beers I tried was most of the time like a little like a punishment. You want to have a beer, but okay. I'll go for something healthy. So
you didn't really enjoy the beer that you were drinking before.
Exactly. It's a small punishment. And maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I think I heard about Mikkeller working on non-alcoholic beer and using a special bugs in it, and it just intrigued me. So I tried to find information about this, and that's it. That's the beginning of all the tests we made to have our own non-alcoholic beer. Yeah.
So you tried different things, different process. Can you talk to us about the process that you're using right now to do your beer? Yeah.
So when I first started my little research about it, I saw, of course, there are all the physical way to brew a non-alcoholic beer, like with thermal. Use thermal energy to remove ethanol. You can also go with membranes, but all of this way are very expensive. So I saw there's also a biological way to make a non-alcoholic beer. There is the kind of the stop fermentation, but for a small brewery like us who don't pasteurize our beers, that's not a good idea. You can also work with your all your mash schedule to try to have the least fermentable sugar as possible. And use after this regular Saccharomyces cerevisiae, so a regular brewery yeast. But as I said, when I heard about Mikkeller using his own strain, that's where I discover all the new bugs to make a non-alcoholic beer. So that's where we first started our tests. I ordered a bunch of several bugs, and we did a lot of fermentation with them, and we found it was much more interesting than what we tasted before on the market. I always there was always from all the other beers a very strong wort flavor, and most of the time I think the brewers want to hide that side with bitterness. It's not a bad idea to balance the beer, but it always disturbed me a little bit. It was not exactly what I wanted. That's where the little punishment was on my side. So when I taste the tests we made with the new bugs, we found some of them very interesting, and that's it. That's where we started to try some of them, and we start doing batches with them, and that's where is coming the discipline.
Nice, and you're really successful at as doing it. So I'm just wondering, can you use those bugs to do other styles of beer or non-alcoholic beer? It's only good for New England IPAs or IPAs.
No, I think it's good for mostly all type of beer. But honestly, we worked only on IPAs, and the reason is one of the other things that you have to deal in non-alcoholic beer is the lack of body. Sometimes the beer is very watery, and so hops is a very good friend to help yes, with that problem. So it can give a lot of body, not maybe not a lot, but it helps to bring your product better. So that's why so far we only brew IPA or like a New England-ish style IPA for our non-alcoholic beer. Yeah.
Speaking of hops, you're using an unusual product in your non-alcoholic beer. You're using American Noble, one of Yakima Chief products. So yeah. Can you talk to me about it? It's pretty interesting because when I was talking to other brewers, they were asking about your process and hops that you were using, and I just said they're using American Noble somewhere in the process. Can you talk to me about it?
Yeah. So maybe because I was scared of that too big bitterness I was talking about, to help with the body, I wanted to use a lot of hops, but I was scared of the bitterness. So we give a try with American Noble in the boil, and it gives very, very good results. It's mostly all of the tests we did are now with American Noble, and I think it's a big part of our success. Yeah.
So you're using American Noble at the boil, and you're you're dry hopping with regular T90s at the end.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for the dry hops, we are using regular exactly. But since we did the collab with you, we also tried cryo hops, and it works pretty well. And there was also a little bit of cryo pop in the boil of the pop cycle.
Nice.
So there was American Noble, a bit of cryo pop, and a lot of cryo pop for the dry hopping. Yes.
Cool. The only thing that bothers me a bit, it's your beer is only distributed in Quebec. I'm pretty sure that lots of brewers around the world would be interested to drink it. You'll be for the first time in Yakima this year for hop selections, and you're going to bring some of your beers in Yakima. So I'm pretty sure that's going to be there's going to be a lot of brewers that's going to be excited to try it. Like I said, it's not to brag, but it's one of the best non-alcoholic beer I ever had. And just to finish our conversation, Jonathan, there's a lot of safety concern about, NA beers, exploding cans, things like that. So what are you guys doing just to ensure that it's not happening on your hand?
Yeah. As I said before, a pasteurizing line is not something most of microbrewery have on their hand. So since you use a special microorganism that most of the time won't ferment maltose, it can be challenging to can your beer and not makes bomb
exploding cans.
Exactly. So it's a lot of critical control points. I will say we use a lot of thermal sanitation here throughout the whole process, from wort transport to canning. And there's also the pH of the beer. Here we try to keep it under maybe 4.2. It helps a lot to keep the beer in a good health and away from contamination. But here it's written on the can of the discipline, the customer have to keep their beer cold. And when I say cold, it's in the fridge. And at first we were kind of maybe not sure what the customer will, how they will deal with this. And what we discovered, it was they are so happy to drink a non-alcoholic beer that tastes that much different, that they are very pleased to put the beer in the fridge. They take the milk away and they put the non-alcoholic beer in the fridge. And in the fridge, our beer can be conserved 2, 3, 4 months, and it's still very, very clean. So that's it. So you have to be careful for that safety concern. But I think we have to change a little bit the culture around that type of beer, and customer will be very happy to drink something very different. Yeah.
Cool. And I'm looking forward to drink the second batch of Pop Cycle that's coming in the upcoming weeks.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to try to bring in Yakima. So
Nice. It's an amazing beer. Looking forward to see you in Yakima. Thanks for your time, Jonathan, and talk to you soon.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks.